He lived in a glass box at the top of the world. From his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the entire city spread out below him, like a carpet of tiny, glittering jewels. During the day, the sun would make the river look like a long, silver ribbon, and at night the cars flowed down the streets like rivers of red and white light. His name was Julian, and to most people who knew his name, it seemed like he had it all. He was an architect, but not the kind who draws little houses on paper. He was the kind who built things that made people stop and stare, things that changed the way a city looked at itself. His apartment was as sharp and clean as his designs. There was a black leather sofa that you could sink into, a table made from a single slab of dark wood, and almost nothing else. No family photos on the walls, no messy piles of books, no souvenirs from trips. It was less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled, "The Man Who Has Everything." And for a long time, Julian believed that he did. He believed his life was a building he had constructed himself, piece by perfect piece, with no room for error. His latest project was going to be his masterpiece. They called it the Ethelgard Spire. It was a needle of glass and steel that was supposed to pierce the clouds, the tallest building in the city's history. It was his obsession. He had sketches of it in every room, on his tablet, on napkins from restaurants. He would wake up in the middle of the night with an idea for a curve in the lobby, or a new angle for the observation deck, and he would have to sketch it out immediately, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and a fierce driving need. This building wasn't just a job. It was going to be his legacy. It was the thing people would remember him for long after he was gone. This thought, the thought of being remembered, was the quiet engine that powered his entire life. He had a woman in his life, a painter named Clara. She was the opposite of his sharp, clean lines. She was all soft colors and happy chaos. Her studio, which he had bought for her in a quieter part of town, was a beautiful mess of paint-splattered canvases, brushes soaking in jars of murky water, and the faint, sweet smell of turpentine and oil paint. She loved him. He knew that, but sometimes he would see a look in her eyes when he talked about the spire. A look he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was more like distance. "Do you ever think about just stopping?" she asked him one evening. They were in his apartment, and he was scrolling through 3D models of the spire on his tablet, the blue light glowing on his face. "Stopping what?" he asked, not looking up. "This, all of it. The racing, the building. We could go somewhere. A little cottage by the sea. I could paint, you could, I don't know, you could build sandcastles." She said it with a smile, but he could tell she was half serious. He finally looked at her, a flicker of annoyance in his chest. "Build sandcastles?" "Clara, I'm building the tallest building in the world." "Why would I want to build a sandcastle?" "Because a sandcastle washes away," she said softly. "And you build another one the next day. It's just for fun. It's just for the moment. Everything with you is forever. It's all about legacy, about what you'll leave behind. What about right now? What about us right now?" He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had an answer, but he knew it wasn't the one she wanted to hear. "This is for us," he said, his voice a little too hard. "The spire, this whole life. It's for our future, so we don't have to worry about anything." She didn't say anything else. She just turned and looked out the window at the city lights, her reflection a ghost beside his own. He could feel the space between them, a quiet, empty space that seemed to be getting wider all the time. He told himself she just didn't understand. She was an artist, she lived in the moment. He was a creator, he built for the ages. They were just different. He went back to his tablet, pushing the feeling of unease away. He had work to do. A few days later, he was in a conference room, a long table of serious men and women in expensive suits sitting in front of him. This was a meeting with his lead engineer, a quiet, careful man named David who had been with him for years. David was standing by a large screen, pointing at a series of complex graphs and soil samples. "The preliminary reports on the bedrock are not as solid as we'd like," David said, his voice calm and steady. "The deeper we drill, the more we're finding a type of compressed clay. It's stable, but it's prone to shifting under extreme weight or seismic activity. To be safe, we'd need to redesign the foundation, go deeper, add more support pylons. It would add significant time and cost to the project." A murmur went through the room. The investors didn't like the words time and cost. Julian felt a hot surge of anger, not at David, but at the situation. The ground. The stupid, uncooperative ground. It was trying to ruin his perfect vision. He stood up, walking to the front of the room and taking the clicker from David. "Thank you, David," he said, his voice smooth and confident, the voice he used when he needed to make people believe in him. "But these are preliminary reports. They're designed to show us the absolute worst-case scenario. We're not building a bridge over an earthquake zone. We're building a monument. We have the best technology, the best materials. We can account for a little clay." He clicked a button, and a beautiful, gleaming image of the finished spire filled the screen. It looked magnificent, impossible, perfect. "This is what we're building," he said, his voice filled with passion. "This is what this city will remember. We can't let a little dirt get in the way of history." He saw the investors relax in their chairs. They were looking at the picture, not at the graphs. They were seeing the legacy, not the risk. He saw David, however, standing off to the side. The engineer wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Julian, and in his eyes, Julian saw that same look of distance he had seen in Clara's. It was a look of quiet, professional disagreement. A look that said, "You are making a mistake." After the meeting, as everyone was filing out, David touched his arm. "Julian, can I talk to you for a second?" "What is it, David?" Julian said, gathering his papers, already moving on to the next thing in his head. "The foundation is the most important part of any structure," David said, his voice low. "Everything else, the beauty, the height, the glass, it's all just decoration if the foundation isn't solid. You know that better than anyone." Julian stopped and looked at him. He felt a flash of the old respect he had for David, but it was quickly swallowed by his impatience. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone clipped. "But I've made my decision. We proceed as planned. Just make it work." He walked away before David could say anything else. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear about doubt or risk or clay. He wanted to build his tower. He wanted to touch the sky. In the weeks that followed, he worked with a feverish intensity. He pushed his team. He pushed the construction crews. He pushed himself. He lived on coffee and adrenaline. Clara tried to reach him, leaving him messages that he would listen to but not return. She wanted to have dinner. She wanted to talk. He didn't have time. He was on the verge of creating something immortal, and she wanted to talk about dinner. He couldn't understand it. One night he was alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. The 3D model of the spire glowed on his computer screen, a perfect digital ghost. He had just gotten off the phone with a reporter from a major magazine, and the interview had gone perfectly. He had charmed them. He had inspired them. The headline was going to be, "Julian, the man who builds the future." He leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over him. He looked around his office, at the awards on the shelves, at the magazine covers featuring his buildings. He had done it. He had built a life that was strong and tall and impressive. He had built a monument to himself. And yet, as he sat there in the silent, gleaming room, a strange feeling crept over him. It was a cold, hollow feeling, like a draft coming from a window he couldn't find. He looked at the perfect building on his screen, then at the perfect, empty room around him. He thought of Clara's quiet question, "What about right now?" He thought of David's warning about the foundation. For a brief, terrifying moment, he felt a tremor, not in the floor but in his soul, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in the foundation of his own perfect world. He shook his head, trying to clear it. It was just exhaustion. He was so close. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the sleeping city. He was the architect of his own life, and he had designed it to be flawless. There were no cracks. There were no flaws. There was only the building and the view from the top. And that was all that mattered. It didn't start with a bang or a shout. It started with a quiet click on a Tuesday morning. He was in his office, sipping a coffee that tasted like victory, scrolling through the morning news on his tablet. Most of it was noise, the usual chatter of a city waking up. But then he saw a headline from a publication he respected, one known for its deep investigative work. It was a simple, almost boring title, "The Price of a Skyline." He tapped on it, expecting a fluff piece about the cost of real estate. The first paragraph was about him. It was respectful, even admiring, mentioning his past work and his ambition for the spire. But as he read on, a cold knot began to form in his stomach. The article talked about the bedrock. It mentioned the compressed clay. It quoted anonymous sources from his own firm, engineers who were deeply concerned about the safety protocols. Then came the words that made his blood run cold. It detailed how his company had submitted a final geological report to the city, a report that was glowing, that declared the ground was perfect for construction. The article then laid out in stark, simple language how this official report was a near-perfect copy of an earlier optimistic draft, but with all of David's warnings and the negative data simply removed. It was a lie, a clean, simple, undeniable lie typed out and signed. He dropped the tablet onto his desk, the clatter loud in the silent room. It was a mistake, he told himself. A misunderstanding. A journalist trying to make a name for themselves by tearing down a success story. He picked up his phone to call his public relations team, but his hand was shaking. Before he could dial, the phone rang. It was his lawyer. The calm, professional voice on the other end confirmed his worst fears. The story was true. The documents were real. And the city was about to launch a full-scale investigation. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. His office became a command center, filled with grim-faced men in sharp suits who spoke in hushed, urgent tones. They were crisis managers, legal experts, people who were paid to put out fires. But this wasn't a fire. This was an earthquake, and they were all standing right on the fault line. He watched them move around his office, touching his things, using his phone, and he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie about his own life. He kept repeating the same phrase, "We can fix this. We can get ahead of this." But the looks on their faces told a different story. The collapse, when it came, was not slow. It was a demolition. The first to go was the project itself. The city, in a move of swift and brutal efficiency, halted all construction on the spire. The cranes, which had once been a symbol of his ambition reaching for the sky, now stood silent and frozen over the construction pit, like giant steel skeletons. The investors, the same men he had charmed with visions of the future, were now circling like vultures. Their phone calls were no longer friendly. They were cold, demanding, filled with threats of lawsuits that would bankrupt him 100 times over. His partners, the people he had built his firm with, the men he had shared late nights and celebratory dinners with, began to distance themselves. One by one, they released statements expressing their shock and disappointment, and their full cooperation with the authorities. They were cutting him loose, throwing him to the wolves to save themselves. He saw an interview with one of them on the news that evening. The man, someone he had considered a friend, looked sincerely into the camera and said, "None of us had any idea. We trusted him, and he betrayed that trust, and he betrayed the trust of this entire city." The word betrayed hung in the air of his silent apartment. He was no longer an architect. He was a villain. The media storm was relentless. His face was everywhere, on every channel, on the front of every paper. They called him a fraud, a con man, a modern-day Icarus whose hubris had led him to forge the very wings he hoped would fly on. The beautiful, gleaming model of the spire that had sat in his lobby was now a prop on news desks, a symbol of arrogance and deceit. He stopped answering his phone. He stopped opening the door. He just walked from room to room in his glass box, watching the world he had built turn against him. The city he had once owned now looked at him with contempt. He felt like a prisoner in his own life. The final blow didn't come from a lawyer or a reporter. It came in the quiet of the evening when he heard the key turn in the lock of his apartment door. It was Clara. She hadn't been answering his calls for days, and a part of him had been clinging to the hope that she was just busy, that she would come back and everything would be okay. But when he saw her face, he knew. She wasn't there to fight for him. She was there to say goodbye. She had a single suitcase with her. She didn't look angry. She just looked empty. The vibrant light he had always loved in her eyes was gone. "I'm leaving, Julian," she said, her voice quiet and steady. It was worse than if she had screamed at him. "The reporters found my studio. They were camped outside all day. They were shouting questions at me." He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he was sorry he had risked everything for a building? That he was sorry he had lied? It all sounded so hollow, so pathetic. "I can't live like this," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. Not just the reporters. "I can't live with this." She gestured around the apartment, but he knew she wasn't talking about the expensive furniture. She was talking about the lie. The big ugly lie that was now the foundation of their life. "You didn't just lie to the city, Julian," she whispered, the pain in her voice cutting him deeper than any news article ever could. You lied to me. All those times I asked you to slow down, to be careful. You told me it was for us, but it was never for us. It was only ever for you. She walked over to him, and for a moment he thought she might hug him or maybe slap him, but she just stood there, a stranger in his home. I loved the man I thought you were, she said, a single tear rolling down her cheek. I don't know who this is. And with that, she turned, picked up her suitcase, and walked out the door. The click of the lock this time was not a beginning. It was an end. He stood there in the middle of the vast, silent room, the city lights twinkling outside the glass, and for the first time, he was truly alone. The glass box was no longer a symbol of his success. It was a cage. And the view was no longer a kingdom. It was just a reminder of everything he had lost. The next few weeks were a blur of legal papers and foreclosure notices. His assets were frozen. His bank accounts, once overflowing, were empty. The penthouse, the cars, the firm, it was all taken away piece by piece, sold off to pay for the mountain of lawsuits he now faced. He was forced to move out of his glass palace. With a single suitcase, just like Clara's, he found a small furnished room to rent in a part of the city he didn't know. It was on the third floor of a drab brick building. The window looked out not at a glittering skyline but at the brick wall of the building next door. The room smelled of dust and old carpet. There was a single bed, a small desk, and a lamp that flickered. He had nothing. He would sit for hours on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank brick wall. He didn't think about the spire anymore. He didn't think about his legacy. He just thought about the click of the lock, the look in Clara's eyes, the quiet, steady voice of his former friend on the television. He had spent his whole life building things up, creating a world of steel and glass that was supposed to last forever, and in the end it had all come crashing down. Not because of a faulty foundation in the ground, but because of a fault in himself. He was a ruin. A man who had lost everything, left with nothing but the quiet, suffocating weight of his own mistakes. The days bled into one another, each one a pale copy of the last. His room, with its single window staring at a brick wall, became his whole world. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the muffled sounds from the apartment next door. The cough of an old man, the cry of a baby, the thump of a bass from a teenager's radio. He had no schedule, no purpose. He would wake late, his body heavy with a sleep that brought no rest. He would walk to the corner store for a can of soup and a loaf of bread, his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched, trying to make himself invisible. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer his. He had sold his watch, the one with the custom face that showed the phases of the moon, for a fraction of what it was worth. Now he had no way to tell the time, except by the position of the sliver of sky he could see from his window. He didn't need to be precise anymore. There was nowhere he needed to be. The silence in his room was the loudest thing in his life. It was a heavy, pressing silence filled with the echoes of what he used to be. He would sometimes catch himself thinking about a problem with a floor plan, or the way light would hit a certain angle of glass, and the thought would be like a shard of glass in his gut. He had built things that defined skylines, and now he couldn't even build a decent day for himself. One afternoon, the silence became too much. The four walls of his room felt like they were closing in. The air thick and stale. He had to get out. Not for food, not for any reason other than to move. He pulled on a worn jacket and walked out of the building, not with a destination in mind, but with a desperate need to escape his own thoughts. He just started walking. He walked past the familiar, shiny parts of the city, the parts he used to command, and each storefront, each gleaming office tower, was a fresh stab of memory. He saw a group of tourists taking a picture of a building he had designed early in his career, and he had to duck into an alley to catch his breath, his back against the cold, damp brick. He kept walking, heading away from the center, towards the older, more worn-out neighborhoods. The streets here were different. The sidewalks were cracked. The buildings were a mix of old brick and faded concrete, with fire escapes zigzagging down their faces. Like metal skeletons, there were no glass towers here, no monuments to ambition. There were just people living their lives. He saw an old woman watering a small pot of geraniums on her windowsill. He saw a group of men playing cards at a plastic table on the sidewalk. He saw kids chasing a ball, their shouts echoing off the brick. It was a world that had existed all along, just a few miles from his own, a world he had never taken the time to see. He had always been looking up at the sky at the future. He had never bothered to look at what was right in front of him. He walked for what felt like hours, his legs aching, his mind a blank slate. He was so lost in the rhythm of his own footsteps that he almost didn't notice the sound. It was a different kind of sound from the rest of the city noise. It was the sound of laughter, high-pitched and full of energy. It was coming from a large, tired-looking building a block away. It was an old community center, the paint peeling, the sign above the door faded by the sun. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months, pricked at him. He crossed the street and stood across from it watching. Through the large, grimy windows he could see inside. Kids were running around playing some kind of game. A few adults were trying to organize them, their voices cheerful but strained. He saw a woman, her hair streaked with gray, trying to set up a table with a stack of paper and a box of crayons. He stood there for a long time, just watching. It was like looking at a different planet. This place was messy, chaotic, and imperfect. The roof had patches of what looked like tar on it, and one of the windows was boarded up with a piece of plywood. And yet it was alive. It was humming with a kind of energy that his pristine, perfect penthouse had never known. He was about to turn away to go back to the quiet safety of his room when he saw her. The woman with the gray hair was standing on a chair, trying to fix a leak in the ceiling. A slow, steady drip was landing in a bucket she had placed on the floor. She was trying to wrap some kind of tape around a pipe, but she couldn't quite get the right angle. She kept stretching, her body wobbling on the chair, and each time she almost lost her balance, a group of kids would gasp and then laugh. He watched, his architect's brain kicking in without his permission. He saw the problem immediately. The tape was the wrong kind. It wouldn't hold. The angle was wrong. She needed a different kind of sealant, and she needed to brace the chair properly. He felt an old familiar twitch in his fingers, the urge to sketch, to solve the problem. He pushed it down. What did he know about it? He was a fraud. He built things that fell apart. He turned to leave, a bitter taste in his mouth. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the image of the woman on the chair, her face a mask of determined frustration. He walked a few more blocks, his mind racing. He thought about the leaky pipe. He thought about the boarded-up window. He thought about the way the kids were using a wobbly, mismatched set of tables and chairs. He saw 100 small problems, 100 little flaws, and for the first time in a long time he didn't see them as failures. He just saw them as problems that could be fixed. The next day he found himself walking back to the community center. He told himself he was just going for a walk, that it was just a coincidence. But he knew he was lying to himself. He stood across the street again, watching. This time he saw a group of teenagers trying to build a small stage in the corner of the main room for a play they were practicing. They were using a bunch of old wooden pallets and some stray 2x4s. They were hammering away, full of enthusiasm, but it was a disaster waiting to happen. The nails were bending, the wood was splitting, and the whole structure was wobbling precariously. He saw one of them, a lanky boy with a shock of bright red hair, try to step onto their creation, and the whole thing nearly collapsed. They all laughed, but he could see the frustration on their faces. That night back in his room, he couldn't sleep. The image of the wobbly stage was burned into his mind. He got up and found a crumpled piece of paper and a pen he had in a drawer. He started to sketch. It wasn't a grand design. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was just a simple, sturdy frame for a small stage. He drew a brace here, a support joint there. He used simple, common materials, the kind of things you could find at any hardware store. He wrote down a list of supplies, a few long screws, some brackets, a sheet of plywood. It felt strange but good. It was the first time in months that his hands had created something instead of just tearing at his own hair. The next day he took the list and went to a hardware store. He bought the things on the list, paying with the last of the cash he had. It wasn't much, just a bag of screws and a few metal brackets. He walked back to the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like a thief. He waited until dusk, when the streetlights came on and the center was empty. He walked across the street, his bag of supplies feeling heavy in his hand. He found a side door that was unlocked and slipped inside. The building was quiet and dark, smelling of floor wax and old paint. He found the pile of pallets and 2x4s in the corner. He worked quickly, his hands moving with a confidence that surprised him. He didn't build the whole stage. He just built the base, the foundation. He used the screws and the brackets to create a simple, strong frame. It was solid. It wouldn't wobble. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it. It was just a wooden frame in a dark room, but it was square. It was strong. It was right. He didn't leave a note. He didn't take any credit. He just slipped out the way he came in and walked back to his room, the feeling of the screws in his hand a small, secret comfort. A few days later, he went back. He stood across the street and watched through the window. He saw the teenagers discover the new frame. They were poking it, testing it, a look of confusion and then dawning comprehension on their faces. The red-haired boy jumped on it and it didn't move. They all cheered. They started building on top of his frame, their hammers ringing out with a new, confident rhythm. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost hurt. It wasn't pride. It was quieter than that. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing something work, of making something a little bit better, of helping without anyone knowing it was you. He started to do it more often. He would see a problem, a leaky faucet, a broken window latch, a wobbly bookshelf, and he would come back at night and fix it. He became a phantom handyman, a ghost of a builder. He left behind a new set of hinges for a door that stuck. He left a small, detailed drawing of how to properly insulate the drafty windows. He never spoke to anyone. He just watched from a distance, a silent observer. He was still a man with nothing, but he was no longer just a ruin. He was a man who was starting to lay a new foundation, one small secret, and perfectly placed screw at a time. The anonymous gifts became a quiet rhythm in his life, a secret pulse that gave his days a new, gentle shape. He was no longer just a ghost haunting his own small room. He was a ghost with a purpose. He would spend his mornings in a state of calm observation, sitting on a bench across the street from the community center, a worn book in his lap that he never really read. He was watching, learning the building's moods and its needs. He saw the way the rain pooled on the flat section of the roof, and the next night he returned with a few bags of gravel and a borrowed trowel, creating a subtle slope to guide the water toward the drain. He saw the children struggling to reach the books on the highest shelf of the tiny makeshift library, and a few days later, a sturdy wooden step stool appeared by the door, its construction simple and strong. He never left a note. He never spoke to anyone. His work was a silent conversation between him and the building, a way of healing a small part of the world while he himself was still so broken. One afternoon, he was sitting on his usual bench when the woman with the gray hair, the one he had first seen wrestling with the leaky pipe, came out and sat on the other end. She was holding a piece of paper in her hands and she was staring at it with a look of intense concentration. He recognized the paper. It was one of his. It was the detailed hand-drawn plan he had left for the new windowsills, complete with measurements and notes about which type of sealant would work best against the winter drafts. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. He was about to be discovered. He braced himself for accusations, for questions, for the inevitable exposure that would shatter this fragile piece he had built. But the woman didn't look angry or suspicious. She just looked thoughtful. She traced the lines on the paper with her finger, a small smile playing on her lips. After a few minutes, she folded the paper carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and went back inside. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A few days later, he saw her again. This time, she was talking to a group of the teenagers who were part of the center's youth program. She was holding up his drawing, pointing to different parts of it, explaining something to them. They were all listening intently, nodding their heads. He watched as they started measuring the old window frames, referring back to his sketch. They were going to build it themselves. He wasn't just fixing things for them. He was giving them the knowledge to fix things for themselves. The thought sent a strange, warm current through him. It was a feeling far more satisfying than seeing his own face on a magazine cover. The woman's name was Ilara. He learned it from hearing one of the kids shout it to her from across the room. She was the center's director, a force of nature who ran the entire operation on a shoestring budget and a seemingly endless supply of hope. He started to notice her more. She was the one who comforted the crying child, the one who mediated the arguments between the teenagers, the one who stayed late to sweep the floors and lock up, a tired but determined look on her face. He felt a growing sense of respect for her, a quiet admiration for the way she held that crumbling old building together with nothing but her own two hands and her unwavering belief in its importance. He became bolder in his anonymous contributions. He found a pile of discarded wooden pallets behind a grocery store and, over a series of nights, he transformed them into a set of sturdy, low-to-the-ground shelves for the reading corner. He sanded the rough edges smooth so no small hands would get splinters. He left them in the main hall, stacked neatly with a simple diagram showing how they fit together. The next morning, he watched from his bench as the kids discovered them. Their shouts of excitement were like music. They spent the whole morning assembling the shelves, their faces alight with the pride of creation. Elara watched them, her arms crossed, a look of pure joy on her face. He was so absorbed in watching them that he didn't notice her walking across the street towards him. He only looked up when her shadow fell over him. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was kinder than he had imagined. He froze, his mind racing. He should run. He should pretend he didn't hear her. But his feet felt like they were nailed to the pavement. "I was wondering if I could ask you something," she continued, gesturing to the empty space on the bench beside him. He just nodded, not trusting his own voice. She sat down, leaving a respectful space between them. She didn't look at him with accusation. She looked at him with curiosity. "We've been finding some very helpful things around the center lately," she began, her tone gentle. "The step stool, the plans for the windows, the gravel on the roof, and now these wonderful shelves." She paused, looking over at the kids who were proudly arranging books on their new creation. "They're incredibly well thought out. The person who is doing this, they don't just fix things. They think about how people will use them. They think about safety. They think about making things beautiful." He stared at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. He felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost choked him. Beautiful? He was a man who had built a monument to his own ego, a lie of glass and steel that could have hurt people. He was the opposite of beautiful. "Whoever it is," she said, her voice softening even more, "they have a gift, a real gift for seeing what a place needs, for seeing what people need." She was quiet for a moment, letting the words hang in the air between them. "I don't know who you are," she said finally, "and you don't have to tell me. But we have a bigger problem. The back room, the one we use for the art classes, the roof is in very bad shape. It leaks terribly when it rains. We've had to put tarps over everything, but the floor is getting ruined. I'm worried the whole ceiling might give way." He risked a glance at her face. She wasn't pleading. She was just stating a fact, a problem she couldn't solve on her own. "I have some drawings," he said, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. He was shocked at the sound of it. It was the first time he had spoken to her, the first time he had spoken to anyone from the center besides a mumbled "thank you" at the corner store. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I thought you might," she said. She stood up. "The back room is unlocked. If you, or your friend, wanted to take a look. Anytime." And with that, she walked back across the street, leaving him sitting there, his heart pounding, a choice hanging in the air. He could disappear. He could retreat back into the shadows and let someone else, someone with more right to help, solve the problem, or he could step out of the darkness. That night, he didn't wait for the cover of darkness. He walked across the street while the sky was still a soft, dusky blue. He pushed open the heavy door of the community center and stepped inside. The building was quiet, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a building he was fixing. It was a place he was a part of. He found the back room. It was just as she had described it. The ceiling was stained with dark, watermarked rings, and the air smelled of damp plaster and mildew. A large blue tarp was draped over a cluster of small tables and chairs, looking like a sad, sagging ghost. He looked up at the damaged ceiling, and for the first time he didn't see a failure. He saw a challenge. He saw a puzzle. He spent the next hour measuring and sketching, his mind clear and focused. He wasn't thinking about his past, about the spire, about the ruin of his life. He was just thinking about joists and beams and waterproof membranes. He was thinking about how to build a small, strong, dry space where children could paint. The next day he came back not as a phantom but as a man. He found Elara in her small, cluttered office. He handed her his new set of drawings. She looked at them, her eyes wide. This is brilliant," she said, looking up at him. "It's so simple, but it's exactly what we need. Where did you learn to do this?" He looked down at the floor. "I used to be an architect," he mumbled. The words felt heavy and strange on his tongue. He hadn't said them out loud in months. He expected her to react with shock, with recognition. but she just nodded as if he had said he used to be a baker or a bus driver. "Well," she said, a warm smile spreading across her face, "you're a very good one, and we would be honored if you would help us build it." And so he did. He started working at the center, not in the shadows, but in the open. He worked alongside the teenagers, teaching them how to use a saw, how to measure twice and cut once. He worked with Ilara, figuring out the budget, sourcing donated materials from local businesses. His hands, which had once been smooth and used to signing contracts, became calloused and stained with sawdust and paint. He discovered a profound joy in the simple, honest labor. He wasn't building a legacy for himself anymore. He was building a roof, and it felt more important than anything he had ever done before. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was just Julian, the man who was helping to build a library. And in the warm, noisy, chaotic heart of that little community center, he was finally starting to feel like he was home. The last screw went in with a satisfying turn. Julian stepped back from the new bookshelf, wiping a smear of wood glue from his hands with a rag. The air in the community center was thick with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and fresh paint. For months, this place had been his secret, his quiet refuge. Now it was his workshop. The back room, once a sad, damp space with a sagging, tarp-covered ceiling, was now a bright, welcoming art studio. The new ceiling he had designed with the teenagers was solid and dry, and the morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, making the colorful paint splatters on the floor sparkle. The kids were already christening the space, their excited shouts and laughter echoing off the newly painted walls. They were dragging canvases and easels into the light, their faces alight with a pride that he had helped them build. He watched them for a moment, a quiet smile touching his lips. He wasn't just the architect anymore. He was a teacher, a helper, a part of the team. He had shown them how to brace the shelves, how to mix the paint, how to see the potential in a pile of discarded wood. In return, they had shown him how to work together, how to laugh at mistakes, and how to find joy not in the finished product, but in the messy, collaborative process of creating it. A few days later, a young woman with a notepad and a camera came to the center. She was a reporter for a small local blog that focused on neighborhood stories. She had heard about the center's amazing transformation and wanted to write a feature. Julian felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The last time a reporter had been interested in his work, his world had imploded. He tried to stay in the background, organizing paintbrushes and keeping his head down, but Ilara, with a twinkle in her eye, would have none of it. "This is the man you need to talk to," she said, pulling him forward. "He's the one who made all this possible." The reporter asked him questions, and he answered them simply and honestly. He didn't talk about blueprints or legacies. He talked about leaky pipes and wobbly shelves. He talked about the ingenuity of the teenagers and the vision of the director. He deflected the praise, passing it on to everyone else. When she asked for his name, he hesitated for only a second before telling her. "Julian," he said. It felt strange to say it out loud, not as a brand, but just as a name. The article was published a week later. It was a small piece tucked between a story about a new bakery and a review of a local play. The headline was simple: "Community Spirit Rebuilds Local Center One Shelf at a Time." There was a picture of him, standing with Ilara and a few of the kids, all of them covered in paint and smiling. He looked older, thinner, and happier than he had in years. He didn't look like a fallen titan. He looked like a man who had found his place. The story didn't go viral. It didn't make national news, but it was shared in the neighborhood. People read it, and people remembered. The phone calls started, but they were not the kind of calls he used to get. They weren't from investors or city officials. They were from other community centers, from small nonprofits, from a church that needed a new ramp for its entrance. They had read the story and they had a problem. They had a leaky roof, a broken staircase, a room that was too small, and they wondered if he might have some ideas. He started taking on small projects, not for money, but for the simple satisfaction of helping. He would spend his days sketching solutions on napkins and scrap paper, and his weekends working with volunteers, teaching them how to build and fix things just as he had taught the kids at the center. He was no longer building monuments to himself. He was building small, practical things that made people's lives a little bit better. He was building a different kind of skyline, one made of ramp railings and sturdy shelves and dry, safe ceilings. One afternoon, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, but that sent a jolt of recognition through him. It was his old partner, the one who had publicly condemned him on television. There was an awkward silence on the line. "Julian," the man said, his voice hesitant, "I saw that article about you. The community center." "Yes," Julian said, his voice calm. "It was good work." "What you did there," his partner continued. "Listen, the reason I'm calling, a developer I know is putting up a new residential tower downtown. It's a big project. They're looking for a consulting architect, someone with a vision. I gave them your name." Julian leaned against the wall of his small room, looking out at the brick wall of the next building. He could almost see it. The gleaming glass tower, the corner office with the panoramic view, the hefty paycheck, the chance to step back into the world he had lost. It was the life he had fought so hard for, the life he had thought would make him happy. It was being offered to him on a silver platter. "That's very kind of you," Julian said, his voice quiet. "But I'm going to have to say no." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "No? Julian, this is a huge opportunity. This is your chance to come back." "I appreciate that," Julian said, and he realized that he truly did. "But I'm already back. I'm right where I need to be." He hung up the phone and felt a profound sense of peace. He had walked away from the ghost of his old life, and it hadn't even hurt. He had been offered the world, and he had chosen a leaky roof and a room full of laughing children instead. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had made the right choice. He used the small wave of attention from the article not to further his own career, but to formalize his work. He created a small nonprofit, a simple organization with a straightforward mission: to connect skilled volunteers with community groups that needed help. He called it Blueprints for Hope. He spent his days not in a corner office, but at a small desk in the corner of the community center's main hall, surrounded by the happy chaos of the place he had helped rebuild. He was no longer a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had found a new way to build. One evening, he was cleaning up the art studio after a class. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. He looked around the room at the brightly colored paintings drying on racks, at the table still smeared with paint, at the sturdy new ceiling overhead. It was a small, imperfect space, but it was filled with more life and more love than any skyscraper he had ever designed. He thought of the Ethelgard spire, the building that was supposed to be his legacy. He wondered if it would ever be built. He realized he didn't care. His legacy wasn't a monument of steel and glass that pierced the sky. His legacy was in the confident smile of a teenager who had learned to use a power saw. It was in the bright, airy room where children could now paint without fear of a leaking roof. It was in the simple, solid bookshelf that held stories and dreams. He had lost everything he thought he wanted. He had lost his name, his fortune, his penthouse in the sky. He had lost the woman he loved and the respect of the world. But in that quiet golden light, standing in the heart of the community he had helped to heal, he understood. Destiny hadn't taken everything away from him. It had just stripped away all the things that weren't really his, leaving him with only what truly mattered. It had taken away his grand, ambitious plans and given him a simple, humble purpose. He had lost everything, only to find that he had everything he needed, right here, in this small, beautiful, imperfect building, surrounded by the people he had chosen to serve. And as he switched off the light and closed the door, he knew he was finally, truly home.